a month ago before the trade deadline when we said if they trade Justin Masterson and as Dribble Cabrera, I'm not sure that it makes one difference either way in their hopes of getting into the playoffs. And I think you're seeing that right now. And I think you're seeing really the example of maybe the importance in keeping the line moving because they'll have, they haven't had that big middle of the order bat for a long time. But they have a bunch of, for lack of a better term, a bunch of gritty guys who just happen to find a way to make a play right now. And that's all they're doing. And that's how they're scoring runs. And as far as, the starting pitching goes, the same thing in my mind. Their approach to the rest of this season, I think, you live and you die with Corey Kluber and Danny Salazar and Trevor Bauer for the rest of this season. And at this point, I toss Carlos Carrasco in with that too. I think I'm not ready I wrote a story to this effect on Monday on our site. I'm not ready to jump on the Carlos Carrasco bandwagon after two good starts. That's not going to make me forget 3 years. But I will say I do think that two good starts with the combination of that they have no one else, I would give him the rest of the season in the rotation, and you go from there and you see what you have. So with the four of them, I think you ride those guys for this year and you see what happens. And I think as you watch this kind of unfold, if they are going to play their way into it or out of it, either way, I think that's important to see in the next 6 weeks from this group that is now a pretty young group. I mean, there are guys that were a part of this team last year, but there are now a good number of guys who didn't contribute to that team last year that now are. And how do they handle this down the stretch? And it's funny because in the last couple of days I've thought of you and your rant and your plea to care about the Cavs and getting into the playoffs last spring. And that's kind of how I feel about the Indians is, I don't think you want to go out and make big moves to try and get into that last wild card spot. But in the same breath, let these guys play and let's see how they perform in the last 6 weeks down the season and if they can play their way in.
And I'm with you there, man. And you know what? Maybe some of the youth, too. The term fresh legs, I mean, you got some of that. And I mentioned the other day, we were talking more about Lindor, but, I said, hey, sometimes that youth a couple weeks back gives you that spark, and we even mentioned, when Cabrera came up in that role years back, which, by the way, I noticed, I don't know where I saw it. It was just like an off note somewhere, but he's not doing poorly since he's gone over and played for Washington. I guess he's hitting about what you'd expect, like 265, but he's playing a pretty good glove over there at second base. But anyways, that, being that spark, kind of that young guy, maybe that's part of it too, man. But I believe, not to lay it all on a guy like Swisher, but, not having those holes and being able to keep innings going and extend things, I mean, it's hard enough when you got 9 guys that can hit, let alone when you only 7 of the 9 can actually hit the ball, and that makes a difference. And I think we're seeing that here. And it's everybody. That's the other thing, too, is we're starting to see, across the board. Like 2 days ago, everybody except 2 guys had a hit, and everybody contributed, Yesterday, you get a little bit from Walters, you get a little bit from Kipnis, a little bit from Aviles, a little bit from Bourne. And having Bourne back, too, that brings another professional veteran guy back into that lineup as well that's been missing up until a few days ago.
Yeah, and I think, kind of what I said about, seeing what guys have in some kind of a pennant race in the next 6 weeks. I think Bourne is one of those guys, too, because while he's obviously a veteran instead of a young player and definitely contributed last year, I mean, I think his health is a gigantic question mark to this roster moving forward, past this season, and what is it that they can expect out of him? I mean, is Michael Bourne going to be a player that they are going to have to baby to keep healthy for 110 or 120 games? Is he going to need additional days off? Or is he a guy that is finally past these leg issues and he can now cut it loose and go out there and play like the guy that the Indians thought they were signing almost 2 seasons ago now. And I think that's important, moving ahead. And all the things that I said this summer about, you have to start to look ahead. I mean, I think the Indians so far, and we talked about this last week, the fine line that Chris Antonetti has to walk. I think, so far they're walking that line perfectly, and that, I don't think that they're not going all in, and I don't think they should. And in the same breath, they're not giving up either. And I think that that's important too. And so, you see what you have and you try to win at the same time and you apply it forward.
What's funny too is we talk back, we look thinking about the trade deadline and leading into it. So we talked about a couple years back in Manny Acta and how the difference with Acta and Francona would be the difference between a team that, is hoping to get some help and doesn't get it and deflates, or one that says, hey, man, we're going with what we got, man. And Terry Francona obviously got them to look around and go, hey, man, they think we got enough to do it. Nobody's coming to the rescue. Let's go out there and play. And we're seeing, each guy do his part, and all of a sudden, what do you know? The team plays better. Now it's time, because he's out there today, it's time for our, weekly talking about Corey Kluber, by the way, as he heads into today's game. As good as his first half was, look at his second half so far. He's allowed 4 runs, 4 earned runs, 4. That is not even a handful in the entire second half. I know it's only 6 starts, but it sounds better and more impressive to say the entire second half. An 0.76 ERA. That's disgusting, man.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Not a lot of wiggle room to improve. The teacher in me, you always look for an area to improve in your best students and your worst. What can they do to make themselves a little better? Corey Kluber doesn't have a lot of wiggle room to get a lot better at this point. And I think what he's done at this point. I mean, I think he's played his way into the Cy Young conversation for sure. And at this point, I think he's, probably for the season, he's probably the second best pitcher in the American League. And like you said, with the numbers since the All-Star break, he's probably the best since the All-Star break. And it'll be interesting. I mean, like so many others, one, can he keep this up for the next 6 weeks? If the Indians are going to make a run, if they are going to, string together some kind of, 12 out of 15 run, they're going to need Corey Kluber, and they're going to need him to come through the way that he has. And can he continue to do that? And kind of going back to that Cavs analogy, I want to see what Corey Kluber can do in big games in September, and if they were so lucky as to play their way into a wild card game and he would pitch it. How does Corey Kluber handle that big spotlight? I think that he would handle it just fine. I mean, for all the jokes of his even keel and demeanor, I think that he would handle it just fine. But you never know until you see it. So I think that would all be important. And, Kluber's a guy who has continued to develop and improve over the last couple years, even at the big league level. I mean, people forget this is a guy that didn't make the team out of spring training a year ago in 2013. So the guy's come a long ways in that time, and I want to see how he finishes this second half. There's a lot of guys that have had good months or a good 6 weeks in their career. I think he's got a good thing going. Let's see if he can finish this season. And that they're going to count on him to be their number one next year. And I think it's important looking ahead that he continue to do that, and hopefully, he really does rebound next year with another ace-like effort for the season. Hopefully,
for sure.
Hopefully, Corey Kluber is the guy they wanted Justin Masterson to be.
And it's funny you mentioned him not making the team. It's the one thing that is crazy, and it drives me nuts because fans do it all the time. They do it even with a Brian Hoyer. Instead of judging a guy based off what they've seen him do. They judge him based on how other people have evaluated them. Like the guy, he's always been a backup, or man, the guy didn't even make the club. Well, a year ago he doesn't make the club, and now people are talking about, oh man, Cy Young, and he's the greatest, and without Corey Kluber we'd be 50 games under 500. But if you just, you know what I'm saying by that, I think it's funny because sometimes people use the wrong things to judge people. It's just because somebody else evaluated talent differently in the past does not mean that players don't, players do get held back, believe it or not. And that's a sign of that. The last 10 starts, 7-1 with a 1.19 ERA, 83 strikeouts, averaging over 8 strikeouts a game in his last 10 starts. Let me ask you something, because for the Indians to contend, he would have to continue at this rate down the rest anyway. So you're not going to make a big leap by assuming that for them to, if both go together, he's going to pitch about as well down the stretch. If he does, forget the Cy Young, because that's voting and that's subjective. But do you think that this season that he has put together, should it finish at the same rate that he's going, would that be one of the top 5 seasons in Indians history by a starting pitcher, you think?
Oh, wow. I don't know about Indians history. I think you'd have to put it on the table. I would have to go back and look at some seasons.
Yeah, of course.
But I mean, I know Addie Joss back in the 1900s or the aughts. He had a couple seasons of ERAs and in the ones. Bob Feller had some pretty incredible seasons before
Absolutely.
World War II. You toss in a year like what Cliff Lee had in 2008. I would be comfortable to say it's probably got to be in the top 10. But I think if you start getting the top 5, you're probably going to start arguing over some seasons. But I think being in that argument is pretty darn good in itself. So yeah, I mean, for what you are saying, I mean, it's definitely a historical year, and not to be the Debbie Downer, but I think for that reason, as we go forward, I think we need to keep that in context, that this is a historical season, and I always go back to this because it bothers me that much, but I feel like there needs to be a name for it, like Danny Salazar syndrome or something, to just count on a guy based on what he did last year to do it the same, and that's where I say, I think Corey Kluber is a very good major league pitcher, but how good is he? Is this his best year of his career, or is this a stretch? Is this the beginning of a stretch of 3 or 4 or 5 years where he's one of the best pitchers in baseball? He definitely is this year, but is he going to put it together for several years, or is this his best season ever? And I think that is, to me, that's the difference between, being on the same level of Felix Hernandez and Clayton Kershaw and, Max Scherzer and maybe Justin Verlander a couple years ago, or, being on that tier a little bit below them. And it would be great if the Indians had a guy that could be in that tier.
No, you're right, and you pretty much hit exactly what I meant. I was in its context. It's a historical season, and two, in the off season, that was the other thing. Is like you said, buy low, sell high. When it's a career, historic type season, it's like the Indians going, yeah, we're going to come back with Salazar, like you said, we're going to come back. This guy had a career year. This guy and this guy, they're all going to do it again this year, and you're just setting yourself up for failure at that point. So yeah, and I'm with you about the last month of the season here, assuming they stay in it. I too think he stays on an even keel, but that is the unknown right now in Corey Kluber's equation, is with the pressure on coming down the stretch. Will he be the same guy? I think he will, but that'll be a good test to see that as we get closer here down there. So that'll be interesting too. And I'm with you on that, man. Speaking of, let me check the update. We've got no score here, bottom of the first. Looks like the Twins have a couple of guys on here, perhaps in the bottom of the first, but we'll continue to update that as if anything happens, if they score. And but you know what? Just in general, looking at the way things are going for the Indians here, I think that you've got Houston on tap, and an opportunity, which is weird, by the way, that random homestand. We were talking about that the other day, kind of throwing 3 games there in the middle of it. But another weekend of promotions here, the team getting hot. What do you think, man? Houston's a tough draw. Do you think the Indians... This is going to be an interesting weekend, by the way, because you got the Tribe, you got the Gladiators playing the Arena Bowl the same night on Saturday, got the Browns doing their thing on Saturday. There was actually a listing in the paper the other day of all the events that are going to be down there. It's going to be like 150,000 people in downtown Cleveland on Saturday. It's been a minute since there's been that kind of